The Curious Adventures of Oliver the Cat. Oliver was no ordinary cat. He lived in a cozy little house with his owner, Mrs. Willow, a kind elderly woman who loved Oliver like her own child. She had found him as a tiny kitten, abandoned in a cardboard box on a rainy day. From the moment she picked him up and wrapped him in her old woolen scarf, they had been inseparable. Oliver had a sleek, shiny coat of black fur and bright green eyes that sparkled with curiosity. But what truly set him apart from other cats was his adventurous spirit. While other cats spent their days lounging on windowsills, basking in the sun, or chasing after the occasional mouse, Oliver was always on the lookout for new and exciting things to explore. It was a sunny Saturday morning when Oliver first noticed something unusual. Mrs. Willow had just left the house to run her weekend errands, and Oliver, as usual, sat on the windowsill watching the birds flit about the garden. His tail twitched with interest, but his eyes were drawn to something else, something shiny and silver glimmering at the far end of the garden, near the old oak tree. Curiosity took hold of Oliver, and he leapt from the windowsill, landing gracefully on the kitchen floor. He padded through the house, slipped through the cat flap, and trotted into the garden. The sunlight warmed his fur, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. But Oliver barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the shiny object near the oak tree. As he got closer, he realized it was a small, silver key. It lay half buried in the dirt, as though it had been there for a very long time. Oliver nudged it with his paw, then carefully picked it up with his teeth. Where had this key come from? What did it open? Oliver was a cat of action, and he knew there was only one way to find out. He carried the key back to the house and placed it on the kitchen table. Mrs. Willow had a collection of old books in her living room, and Oliver often saw her reading about all sorts of magical things, hidden treasures, secret doors, enchanted forests. Maybe the key belonged to something magical. His mind buzzed with possibilities. When Mrs. Willow returned home, Oliver meowed loudly, pacing around the kitchen table to get her attention. "What is it, dear?" Mrs. Willow asked, her voice soft and full of affection. She saw the key lying on the table and raised an eyebrow. "Where did you find this?" she asked, picking up the key and examining it closely. It was small, intricately designed, with tiny symbols etched into its surface. It looked ancient. Mrs. Willow smiled. It reminds me of the keys in those old stories I used to read as a child. Oliver's ears perked up. Stories? Keys? This was getting more exciting by the minute. He watched as Mrs. Willow took the key and wandered over to the bookshelf. She pulled out a dusty old book with a green leather cover and golden letters on the spine. "The Enchanted Garden," she read aloud. "This book was one of my favorites," she said, opening the cover. "It's about a secret garden that can only be found by those who possess a special key. The garden is said to be filled with magical plants, talking animals, and hidden treasures." Oliver's tail swished eagerly as Mrs. Willow flipped through the pages. "Ah, here it is," she said, showing Oliver an illustration of a door hidden in the roots of an enormous tree. The door was locked, but in the picture, there was a small keyhole, just the right size for a key like the one Oliver had found. "You don't suppose?" Mrs. Willow's voice trailed off, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Could it be real? Oliver didn't need any more convincing. He knew that the key was special. He pawed at the book, urging Mrs. Willow to read more. "The garden is said to be hidden in the oldest part of the forest," she continued. "It's guarded by creatures of magic, but those who find it are rewarded with a lifetime of wonder and discovery." Oliver purred with excitement. This was the adventure he had been waiting for. The very next day, Oliver and Mrs. Willow set off for the forest. Mrs. Willow brought a picnic basket, some blankets, and, of course, the key. The forest was a short walk from their home, and as they entered, Oliver felt a thrill run down his spine. The trees here were tall and ancient, their branches forming a thick canopy overhead. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. For hours they walked, deeper and deeper into the woods, searching for the door from the book. Mrs. Willow was humming a soft tune, enjoying the peacefulness of the forest, but Oliver was focused. He knew they were getting closer. His sharp eyes scanned the ground, looking for anything unusual. And then, he saw it. Half hidden by roots and fallen leaves was a small, wooden door. It was worn with age, its wood cracked and faded, but there was no mistaking it. It was the door from the book. Oliver dashed over to it and pawed at the ground, clearing away the dirt. Mrs. Willow gasped when she saw it. "Could it be?" she whispered, kneeling beside the door. She pulled out the key and gently inserted it into the lock. Click. The door creaked open, revealing a dark tunnel that led deep into the earth. Without hesitation, Oliver darted inside, his heart pounding with excitement. Mrs. Willow followed, carrying a small lantern to light the way. The tunnel was narrow at first, but soon it opened into a vast underground chamber. In the center of the chamber was a garden unlike any Oliver had ever seen. Flowers of every color bloomed, glowing softly in the dim light. Vines hung from the ceiling, and strange, shimmering fruits grew on trees with silver bark. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, though there was no wind in the cave. But the most amazing thing of all was the animals. Birds with rainbow-colored feathers flew overhead, their songs filling the air with music. Rabbits with fur as white as snow hopped through the grass, and in the distance, Oliver could see a fox with a coat of pure gold watching them curiously. Mrs. Willow was speechless. She knelt down and touched one of the glowing flowers, her eyes wide with wonder. It's real," she whispered. "It's all real." Oliver, too, was in awe. He had always known there was more to the world than what he could see from the windowsill. Now, here he was, standing in a magical garden filled with beauty and mystery. For the rest of the day, Oliver and Mrs. Willow explored the garden. They found hidden paths lined with flowers that changed color as they walked by. They discovered ponds with water so clear that they could see all the way to the bottom, where silver fish swam lazily. And, in the center of the garden, they found a stone fountain with water that sparkled like diamonds. As the sun began to set, Mrs. Willow sat on a bench beneath a flowering tree, watching the animals play. Oliver sat beside her, his green eyes bright with happiness. "We'll come back here often," Mrs. Willow said, stroking Oliver's fur. "This place is too beautiful to keep to ourselves." Oliver purred in agreement. He had found his adventure, and it was more wonderful than he had ever imagined. And so, the curious adventures of Oliver the cat continued, with each day bringing new discoveries and magical moments. He had found a world of wonder, and with Mrs. Willow by his side, there was no limit to the adventures they would share.